Welcome to this special Neuropsychiatry Research and Education Group meeting, because it's our great pleasure to introduce Professor Stuart Mostovsky, who is a paediatric neurologist and autism researcher, particularly around the interface of movement and motor symptoms and social and cognitive development. And it's by happy coincidence, he's coming to London. We haven't paid for him to come straight over directly to us. But he's very kindly popped down to South London whilst here in London to give us a lecture. So he's going to be talking to us about how a moving lamppost from human eyes to computer vision can help address heterogeneity and improve clinical care. And I think Stuart's work is some of the most interesting stuff I've read in the last few years, and probably even the last decade, actually, because I think it really ties together the sort of motor, cognition, social work, which as neuropsychiatrists we know is important, but we all tackle it from our different angles. But I think this has got quite a powerful sort of way of explaining many things about perhaps autism, but also other disorders as well. So thank you so much, Stuart, for coming to talk to us. And as usual, just keep your cameras and mics off, but we'll call you in if you put your hand up to ask questions or if you put them in the chat afterwards. So thank you once again, Stuart, for talking to us. I really appreciate it.
Well, I can't begin to say how much I appreciate the kind offer. There are many reasons that I came to London. Apparently, one of them was to bring the good weather. I arrived on Thursday, so I think that my timing was exactly right. The other was to bring this corgi, Adelaide, who is 2 years old, and we had to take her to Buckingham Palace and other places, given the significance and importance of corgis. And I just have to say, too, I just took this photo an hour ago. I got whisked over in this lorry. So I think that, like, clearly quite an auspicious time here in London. But I am here to talk about this topic. It's a sort of long and winding title, to deference to Paul McCartney. And I think that it'll become clear sort of everything I'm trying to sort of squeeze into this title here. There's a lot of work that we do on examining motor features in autism, as well as other developmental disorders, particularly ADHD, but also at some level reading disability and other developmental disabilities. But we've focused a lot over the last few decades on autism and ADHD, and have found distinct patterns in their differences in motor control and learning, have related those patterns to the core features that define these disabilities, these challenges related to ADHD and autism as defined more by cognitive and social features. And we think we're now maybe getting to the point where we can apply these tools to better identifying important relevant phenotypes, subphenotypes, addressing the heterogeneity of these disorders, as well as then maybe moving to clinical care. Some of this work that we've done that I won't be presenting on today is in collaboration with Nick Putz and his team. Nick was at Johns Hopkins with us. I was one of his mentors there. He does outstanding work looking at tactile sensory features. I will let him speak to you about that, about the outstanding work that he's done and we've done in collaboration there. It takes a village, it takes a team, and I want to acknowledge up front the large number of people who've contributed to this and the support from federal funding as well as foundations that have supported the work. I like to often start my talks with this slide of an amoeba. And the reason I talk about an amoeba is because it sort of simply displays this notion that as a living creature, as opposed to this coffee cup, it has an ability to dynamically interact with its environment. That is what is, I mean, I know there's all kinds of things and long philosophical treatises about what is life, but basically it boils down to an ability to dynamically interact with the world around you. This coffee cup, if left alone, would be quite stable and outlive all of us, but it has no ability to dynamically interact. So there's sort of some give and take there. The amoeba doesn't live very long, but it does have this ability to do one of two things, basically, to sense something attractive in the environment and move towards it, a food substance, so to speak, or to sense something that is chemotoxic, dangerous, and to move away from it. And I would offer that we are really not that different. We basically, in much more complex ways, mapped over much larger spans of time, move towards things we're attracted to, including food substances, move towards away from things that are dangerous. But then we also use our movements to engage in things like social interaction, as well as high-level cognition. I like to show this image of Garry Kasparov playing chess, because if you think about chess, and if I stopped 100 people on the street and asked if chess a motor sport or a thinking game, I guarantee you pretty much everybody would say thinking game. However, if you think about what you're doing during chess, you are basically mapping movement in a very complex way over time, and all kinds of possibilities in movement. So this was all very summarized very nicely in a TED Talk by Daniel Wolpert, who we as in America stole from you. He was at Oxford and now he is at Columbia. And he gives the TED Talk, which I'm just going to play a quick clip of.
Why do we and other animals have brains? Not all species on our planet have brains, so if you want to know what the brain is for, let's think about why we evolved one. Now, you may reason that we had one to perceive the world or to think, and that's completely wrong. If you think about this question for any length of time, it's blindingly obvious why we have a brain. We have a brain for one reason and one reason only, and that's to produce adaptable and complex movements. There is no other reason to have a brain. Think about it. Movement is the only way you have of affecting the world around you. That's not quite true. There's one other way, and that's through sweating. But apart from that, everything else goes through contractions of muscles. So think about communication. Speech, gestures, writing, sign language, they're all mediated through contractions of your muscles.
So he goes on to, I recommend the TED Talk, talk about very interesting things like the sea squirt and why you can't tickle yourself. But I will let you go view that. This has been discussed by other neuroscientists and thinkers in the field. Joachim Fuster talked about this as well in terms of the mapping the brain itself, and the idea that we basically, everything that we do from simple movement to complex cognition is basically action perception coupling, that we perceive something in the environment and we act on it at a very simple, more basic level. I don't have a pointer, I guess, but what's that? Oh, there it is in the screen. Okay, so I will. So it's we connect sensory and motor, and this is primary sensory and primary motor to primary somatosensory and primary motor to engage in very simple actions that, in terms of a temporal window, is very brief. But then we can also plan more complex movements like finger sequencing or tool use. That gets into a little more of a sensory association cortices and premotor cortices, which I'll get into some detailed discussion today, as well as then the mapping of things like working memory and other higher order cognitive things that connect more further posterior association cortices, for example, Raman area 40 with prefrontal cortex. So, he sort of displays this idea of how this expands throughout the brain and over time. And the interesting thing as well is that, and not surprisingly, that ontogenetically, we develop these systems in sequence. That initially we develop in terms of the cerebral cortex, the earliest parts that develop in complete development, including myelination, are primary motor and sensory cortices, and then sort of expands out from that along the lines of what Joachim Fuster presented. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to sort of, recognize and tip my hat to the fact that we have this heterogeneous disorder where we have defining features that include, and really at its core, social communicative skill development and differences in that, but also repetitive behaviors ranging from motor stereotypies to insistence on sameness and routine, as well as then now more recently discussions of hypo and hyper response to sensory stimuli. And while not included in the DSM, and I am not an advocate for necessarily including this in the DSM, I want to make that clear, There is nevertheless highly prevalent difficulties with motor skills. And then in people's clinical experience, including my own, parents and people with autism typically report this as being very common. There's a particular difficulty, and I'll get into more details of this in the talk, with skills reliant on dynamic visual motor integration, such as ball catching and imitation. I am told, I was told by Bergeron that Chris Gilberg is fond of apparently saying that if you want to know if somebody has autism, throw them a ball. And then also clearly difficulties with imitation, which may be very crucial to social skill development, and something I'll talk about in detail. There also seems to be, and this is sort of the summary before the talk, that I'll get into the details of further, a bias for reliance on proprioceptive feedback from the intrinsic body. So feedback from your own muscles is where the proprioceptive feedback lies. And so this is why I can close my eyes and touch my nose with my finger, because I know where my body is in space because of this proprioceptive feedback. And a tendency to discount visual feedback from the extrinsic world. So a lot of this then relates to sort of, I want to shout out my primary mentor in my career, Martha Bridge Dankla, who had this notion of neighborhood signs. She was trained as an adult neurologist, Norman Geschwin, Edith Kaplan, people like that in Boston, and Derek Denny Brown. And she then started working with children and looked at their motor features and began to recognize that there seemed to be parallels between the development of motor abilities and development of cognitive abilities in children. She applied this to reading disability, as well as then the burgeoning notion in the 70s and 80s of ADHD. Again, a topic I won't get into today, but for which we've sort of mapped neighborhood motor signs as well as then a bit in autism, which I have came to her actually when I first came to her in 1995. I came to her with an interest in pursuing that. So one can question, well, that's all very nice, but why should we even think about motor function in autism? And I would offer that there is a number of reasons to do this. One is that motor, or more generally referred to as procedural learning, is crucial to the development of a wide range of skilled behaviors, and the motor signs may therefore serve as markers for deficits in parallel brain systems important for control of higher order behaviors, for the sort of some of the reasons that I've already laid out, that the brain unfolds in this way with parallel systems that are focused initially early on execution of simple movements, but then there may be recapitulations of those patterns in higher order perception action coupling. That said, one could still say, why not go and really look at the higher order features? But then there's the fact that the motor examination offers an ease and precision not necessarily achievable in examinative complex behaviors, can be more precisely defined and often more reliably produced, and that the anatomic and physiologic basis is much better delineated. And so a quick summary of all that is that these examining these sensory motor differences can be acquired objectively using computational tools, can be leveraged potentially to detect risk for autism earlier on, given the ease and precision, can potentially help identify patterns of brain development underlying autism, given we understand the motor physiologic basis to a much greater degree, and we can then potentially leverage all that, and this is what we're working towards, to guide planning and monitoring of targeted interventions. So in this talk, I'm going to sort of go through these behavioral features that we see, talk about some underlying brain features as well, and then relate that to some video game type approaches that we're taking at this point, looking particularly at motor imitation. So this is the sort of more simplified summary of the core deficits in autism. Social communication, interaction are sort of coupled together now. And there are all these other sensory features, but this triad is really, which sort of is really more the DSM-4 version, really sort of summarizes the main core features: social interaction, communication, and stereotype behaviors. And as mentioned, there are these additional motor skill deficits, which I'm going to get into the notion of dyspraxia in a minute, but for the moment, let's just sort of refer to them as dyspraxia. I will sort of unfold that how we think that there are findings that are interrelate these motor skill deficits with these core features. And then in particular, given that autism is a particularly developmental disorder, and by that I mean you really rarely, if ever, see autism as the result of acquired brain injury. I would contrast that honestly with ADHD, for example, where you can get a frontal lobe injury, Phineas Gage isn't Phineas Gage anymore, and see impulsive features, hyperactive, inattentive features that are similar to ADHD. You really don't see that with autism. It's a pretty uniquely developmental disorder. And so that we need to think about how we learn and acquire these skills. And so we'll talk about studies that look at that as well. All right, so starting with sort of where we started historically, we thought about, okay, what is the sign that we really want, a motor sign that we really think speaks to autism more than anything? And we felt that that praxis was something that would make a lot of sense to look at. So starting around 25 years ago or so, we started to look at praxis, and we're not the only ones. Deborah Dewey and others have reported these findings, where we look at the ability to perform skilled learned actions, and particularly something referred to as ideomotor praxis, which refers to the ability to perform those actions to imitation, mimicry, and command. So mime, what refers to as mime, as well as with the actual tools. It includes communicative gestures, such as waving goodbye, which are intransitive, and then use of tools, such as so waving goodbye and using a hammer, for example. And again, we assessed with gesture, command, imitation, tool use. And we undertook a series of studies where we looked at this, and I'm just going to show you a video quickly, which is an exemplar video of a typically developing children being asked to erase a chalkboard, followed by a child with autism being asked, this is with permission from them.
Show me how to hold an eraser and a chalkboard out in front of you.
So there's the typically developing child.
Show me how to use an eraser and a chalkboard out in front of you.
So he clearly understands the command because he does something similar, but you could see he either has what's called a body part for tool error, where his hand is the eraser, which is a sign of immature praxis, and then he has an inconsistent relationship with the board as well. And so we did a lot of detailed study of this coding, adapting adult approaches for this, and initially this is the first paper we wrote on this nearly 20 years ago, finding that there was fairly symmetrical impairments in gesture, command, imitation, and tool use. And then follow-up papers subsequently where we looked at not only children with typically developing children with autism, but also included children with ADHD, and found on the top right, you could see that we have praxis and percent correct, so higher is better. And I should mention, I forgot to mention that almost all the things I'm going to talk about, actually all the studies today I'm going to talk about, are with school-age children. They're children who are also have cognitive functioning that with IQs of at least 70 or so or above. In the top panel here, you could see that the children with ADHD, a little bit worse at praxis than the typically developing children, but overall nowhere near the impairment that we saw in children with autism. Children with autism were significantly impaired compared to both these groups, typically developing and ADHD. Now, contrast that to the PANAS is a motor battery. I'm not going to get into detail about it, that Martha Dankler developed, that looks at more basic motor control, and not too dissimilar to the BOT and the MADC and sort of just general construct. There are important differences, but I'm not going to get into it. The main point I want to make here is lower scores are better. And you can see here, ADHD children actually show impairment, not quite as severe as autism, but both show impairment compared to typically developing children, in contrast to what we see with praxis. So in thinking about the neurology of praxis, this is sort of adapted from Marco Iacoboni's image that refers to mirror neuron system. And I do this on purpose, because really at the core of the mirror neuron system, and I'm not referring specifically to mirror neurons, the macaque monkey F5 neurons. I'm referring to the whole system that's necessary for imitation, but then also for praxis dating back 100+ years. We've understood that it's related to these connections. Actually, while it's sort of implied here, the right hemisphere, it's really predominantly left hemisphere, between parietal and frontal premotor systems. So parietal, inferior parietal cortex, and frontal premotor regions, with the STS also then being important, superior temporal sulcus for self-other mapping as it applies to online imitation. And if you think about this in a developmental framework, so we found that these children are impaired in praxis, but how did they get here? Like, why are they not showing as good ability to perform these skills? And if you think about this, whereas in an adult model, you can lesion parietal systems and lose the ability to both recognize people performing gestures as well as perform those gestures. You lesion the connection to the frontal system or the frontal system itself. You can still recognize people performing gestures, but you can't perform them anymore. In the developmental framework, these things sort of develop in parallel. We develop the ability to both perform actions and then understand and recognize those actions, in some ways theory of mind, things like that to understand what other people are doing. It's sort of simultaneously. We develop these internal models of action that involve connections between these systems that allow us to do that. And so what we did is, as a follow-up, is a task where you just had to simply look at whether an image like this and identify, not perform the action, but just simply identify which of the three were the correct answer. And in that same study that I showed you, so we did this in that same study I showed the slides from the McNeil 2012 study. And sure enough, we found that children with ADHD pretty much did just fine on this task. But children with autism actually showed difficulty, suggesting that there's not only this problem with performing these skilled actions, but even recognizing these skilled actions as performed as others. So that there's this parallel impairment in postural knowledge and in praxis. And I would sort of suggest that this is sort of a foundational sign for the sort of parallel things that we see in autism, where there's a problem with social awareness and social skills. Like, so the children with autism not only have problems with performing those skills, but also as recognizing those actions as performed by others. And I think it's important to mention that they are social skills after all. These are not social facts we do memorize, and that is actually often a way that people work with individuals with autism, is to use more sort of declarative learning approaches. Let's actually explicitly teach you how to engage in this social action, but we mostly learn these as skills, procedurally and implicitly. We have found association between praxis and measures of autism severity, such as total ADOS score, sort of supporting this idea that there's this sort of interrelationship. And I would submit that this, in some ways, this sort of dyspraxia for social skills is a bit of the sort of the shake hand diagnosis that we have with autism. In other words, when clinicians see people with autism and they get a sense of whether they have autism or not, a lot of clinicians will tell you they get a sense sort of fairly quickly and just sort of almost naturally by just sort of interacting with the person. And I think I would offer that some of that is that ability to just sort of naturally engage in smooth execution of these kinds of skill behaviors. So let's move now to the acquisition, to the learning. So we began to work with colleagues of ours, actually, who are colleagues of Daniel Wolpert, who are motor computational control and learning experts, to look at this. We had a number of motivations to do this, as first of all, that we're seeing these motor skill impairments, but then also in thinking about autism, that the development of social skills involves learning a series of complex action and movement patterns, and that in learning these, as mentioned, we form these internal perception action models, which support both performing social actions as well as understanding other social actions. And these are the sort of parallel difficulties with socialization that we see in autism, and that autistic people often report difficulty with automatically performing these social actions with compensatory use of declarative scripts to do this. The one time I met Temple Grandin, actually through Martha, like 25 years ago, she actually offered to me that when I talked to her a little bit about this burgeoning area of research, she said, yes, when I get into a social situation, I actually have to tell myself, somebody sticks out their hand, I have to actually remind myself that I am supposed to stick out my hand too and shake their hand. Like, so that there is this use of scripting and scripts to sort of to overcome this. So it suggested us to them maybe there's something difficult and challenging about motor learning. So we did this task, this complicated in-laboratory task, where and this is Courtney Haswell, the first author of performing the task. She at the time was a student in Reza Shadmir's lab. This was done in collaboration with him and his team, and published this in 2009, where what happens is participants are looking at a screen, and they can only see the screen. They can't see the joystick that they're manipulating underneath, but they see a cursor that matches the position of the joystick, although that can be decoupled, and was decoupled in some of these instances, and then did a series of studies looking at arm reaching adaptation in autism. Where the children learned, what happened is that they had to learn to adapt their movement because the joystick was being perturbed. It was being moved by a robot in a particular pattern direction, and they had to learn to hit the target that was ahead of them after upon experiencing this perturbation. And so what we found, I can give an entire talk on the details of these studies, but to summarize, what we found is that that children with autism, ASD children, as compared to not only typically developing children, but children with ADHD, showed greater learning and increased reliance on proprioceptive error. So based on the error that they were feeling, as opposed to the error that they were seeing on the screen. There's some distinct ways we did this. I think the Marco study, the last study that was published in Brain, most clearly and easily demonstrates that in that what we did in the Marco studies is we actually decoupled it. So people would feel things, the arm being pushed, but yet they would see the cursor go straight to the screen. And interestingly, typically developing children under those instances made more errors than the children with autism, because the children with autism discounted what they were seeing and relied more on what they were feeling in their arm. And so this is sort of what was then calculated based on those trials, that we were able to show that children with autism learned much more from proprioceptive error and learned much less from visual error. Furthermore, in those studies, we show that there was an association with some core features of autism as measured with the ADOS and SRS. So this is in part in tandem. Nancy Minshew, as with many things, preceded me. But a number of subsequent studies have reported this elevated proprioceptive versus visual bias in autism. I'm not going to go into details of studies, but just show that there have been several studies that have reported on this. And actually, I have buried in the end of my talk individual slides on each of these studies if anybody has any questions about these particular studies. And where we've been moving then since then, based on this, is in a number of directions. The first is, so this was a very complicated laboratory test that took an hour to do. No way could we do this in sort of in a home or clinic setting. And so can we come up with better ways to sort of assess this? So because this involves long data collection, lab visits, complex, non-portable, and expensive equipment. So what we've moved to now, I have a fantastic junior colleague, Dan Lidstone, who's developed this Haptocart task that we haven't yet published on, but we've gathered data that's hot off the presses that I'm going to show you, where it involves short data collection with a fun video game, driving game, where we then perturb the wheel, either like using altering the proprioceptive feedback given through the wheel, or we perturb what they're shown visually. And so this is sort of just a demonstration with permission of the child performing this. I will mention, by the way, the window is open here only for us to record the video, but we keep the window closed and the lighting stable for all of it. So there's Dan, who developed this fantastic task, and we developed this in collaboration with the Hopkins Haptics and Medical Robotics Lab, headed by Jeremy Brown. And here are our results. Just as we saw with the sort of more complex task, we see that interesting. So we see very robust effects here. Actually, this is actually, I should update this. This is 0.007 now. And when we run this regression model with more subjects recently, but we see that while every child, typically developing child, shows a bias towards relying on what they're seeing on the screen versus what they're feeling on the wheel, so the visual bias, the children with autism, it's about 50-50. And furthermore, that this correlates with autism severity as measured with the ADOS and across the groups with the SRS. So we have a general pattern that we've been observing behaviorally, where, all right, the children have dyspraxia, they have these motor skill deficits. When we look at how they learn motor skills, they see the distinct thing that we're finding and other groups are finding is they rely more on feedback from their own internal world, so kind of heuristically makes sense, and rely less on what they're seeing and experiencing by looking at the world around them. This motivated us to look at visual motor connectivity within the brain. Actually, it was motivated, I'll say very quickly, by an initial study with a uniquely deafferented patient who had a spinal cord injury that resulted in an inability to get feedback, proprioceptive feedback from their arms and legs. This person, over years and a lot of effort, recently ran a marathon. And they have to look at their to get that feedback. That's how they had to relearn this. It's a remarkable story. And they found remarkably increased connectivity between visual systems and motor systems in the brain. And so what we did was look at that. We used what's called an independent component analysis approach. I'm not going to get into details on that, as opposed to a seed-based approach, but identified visual seeds and motor seeds, and we identified three visual components and three visual components and two motor components, and found a distinct pattern that was then replicated. And this was published, this is Mary Beth Neeble's work and published in Biological Psychiatry, where we found, both using our own sample from Kennedy Krieger Institute and a sample from Abide, actually Kathy Lord's sample that was gathered and put in Abide, that in both cases we found a distinct pattern of decreased connectivity between a particular higher order visual component and ventral motor component. And furthermore, amongst the children with autism, we saw a correlation with social response in the scale measure of autism symptom severity, core autism symptom severity, such that higher severity was associated with lower visual motor connectivity. So this suggests that in addition to this high reliance on proprioceptive feedback, there's this discounting of visual feedback, and particularly we think, and that the biggest evidence supports that the idea that it's when it's dynamic visual stimuli. So not a visual, like processing a visual stimulus that's sitting in front of you. So for example, there is this known block design advantage in autism for some people with autism on IQ testing. But that is a stable image that's sitting still. Now you're allowed to move the blocks around, but that's your own manipulation. It's more when you have to do things like catch a ball and imitate other people's actions. And there have been a series of studies from our own lab and others that have reported problems with ball catching in children with autism, not only compared to typically developing children, but children with ADHD. There's also was a study from our colleague Becky Landa at Kennedy Krieger Institute with infants with autism showing reduced anticipatory reaching, but not gaze response to ball rolling in infants at high risk for autism. And then we've done more sort of detailed analysis using Dan Lidstone initially before he came to me when he was doing his doctoral work in Las Vegas, and then working with me, found dynamic tracking of visual target to be impaired in children with autism not only compared to typically developing children, but children with ADHD, as well as fetal alcohol syndrome children. So this is the study we then published together in 2020 that shows this, where they have to have a force grip, and they have to either, so this game, this rocket ship, and they either have to hold it steady in a target or move it, like adjust the force to track the target. And when they have to hold it steady with the target, they really don't perform any different than the other three groups of children. But when they have to dynamically track it, they show much more error, significantly more error compared to the other three groups, particularly typically developing, but also compared to the fetal alcohol and ADHD groups as well. I will say as a quick plug, we're now working with some close colleagues at Child Mind Institute, Mike Millam, Arnold Klein, and others to develop some. So again, like the Haptocard task we developed as a simpler task, we want to develop some sort of more like tablet-based tasks that can look at visual motor, dynamic visual motor integration that don't require sort of that high laboratory level. And so we're working on that as we speak, but have no results to report for that. So I listed all these sort of these studies that sort of support the idea that there's a problem with dynamic visual motor integration, but I saved the most important for last, which is that there's been a number of studies that have reported, including from our own laboratory, problems with visual motor imitation. So imitation is something that has been thought about a lot and considered a lot in autism for decades now. Sally Rogers and Bruce Pennington wrote a pioneering paper in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken, discussing how imitation may be a core basic impairment for some children with autism. And it's been examined in two sort of distinct ways. One is sort of spontaneous imitation or mimicry. And I have a colleague here actually who's now at Nottingham Trent University, Bahar Tungchen, fabulous work looking at mimicry in young developing children with and without autism. And that's basically doing things like sitting with typically a very young child and performing an action like picking up a toy phone and seeing if the child imitates you or not. But then there's examination that's generally done with older and less affected populations, where we do elicited visual motor imitation, where we actually perform an action and ask the child to imitate it as best as possible. And we did some of that with our praxis examination, but not to the level of detail that we were interested in. And actually, sorry, it was not the early 90s, it was 1996 where this was first discussed by Sally Rogers and also Justin Williams, I should mention here as well, was an early pioneer in this thinking. There's been numbers of studies that show that children imitate others' actions less frequently and with less precision, and that it's associated with core features. And then imitation ADHD has been associated with several autism-related constructs listed here. So the traditional methods for assessing imitation, particularly elicited motor imitation, have been somewhat challenging because they've relied on human raters who look at videos and then try to code the accuracy of the imitation in those videos. And this can introduce bias. It requires a lot of time and effort. There's inconsistent operational definitions across labs, even sometimes within labs, which can be problematic, so for establishing reliability. And so actually, Edwards shouted this out in 2014 as the need for developing more consistent definitions and methodologies. But that was about a decade ago, and there wasn't this great technology that has since come along that allows us to actually move beyond even using human coding. And that's using machine learning, AI methods under the rubric of what's generally known as computer vision. And so this gets to the title of my talk and my favorite metaphor that everybody in my lab knows, because it's really crucial to remain humble as a scientist, and we must always keep this in mind. So does anybody know the drunk under the lamppost metaphor? Okay, but not everybody, right? So the story goes is that it's pitch black night. There's no light in the sky, no moonlight, nothing. There's a single lamppost with light, and there's a drunk on all fours, and he's feeling around on the ground, and a cop comes along and says, "What are you doing?" And they used to say keys, but you know, these days now we say wallet or something, since we don't want to think about him driving. And the cop says, well, where did you drop it? And the drunk says, over there by the bar. And the cop says, well, why are you looking here? And the drunk says, because this is where the light is. And this is what we do in science. And as humans just living in the world all the time, we rely on the perception we have. So first of all, as humans, we have different perception, for example, than distinctly from bats. And so we view the world, so to speak, very differently than even other species, and have our own particular biases in how we view the world. But certainly then what happens in science is all the time is new instruments come along, new ideas come along. Suddenly there's magnetic resonance imaging and everybody throws everything upside down. So this happens all the time. So we're using these methods, this lamppost of our own human eye to look at imitation. And then, we move to, about 100 years ago or so, moved to be able to use cameras to actually record it. Prior to that, the best we had was our own immediate observation and working memory, and maybe notes. And so we've obviously had advances in cameras that we use. But now we use even more advanced systems. And, when speaking to the camera, I love to tell this story. I'm getting late, but I'm going to tell this story quickly anyway. It's a distinctly American story. Leland Stanford, Stanford University, governor of California at one point, you could see a fairly, let's say somewhat maybe pompous man, certainly overachiever. He was quite a horse enthusiast. And up until the 1800s, it was thought that horses galloped in a particular way, where when they were in their air, their legs were spread apart. And Leland Stanford was convinced that that is entirely not true. And he was so sure of it, he hired this really imaginative great person, Edwin Muybridge, to film horses. And Edwin Muybridge, who was also pals with John Muir, and eventually he and Leland, of course, had a huge falling out. But in this brilliant moment, he set up a series of cameras, and one horse would roll over with a pulled buggy would roll over these series of cameras and set them off while a horse ran down the track. Edwin Muybridge went on to record all kinds of videos of movement. But first of all, initially, proved that yes, when the horse is in the air. So suddenly we had this new lamppost, and all these paintings that people had of horses were completely upended. He went on to actually invent the zoopraxiscope, which is sort of the early camera, like where you would have this thing that would twirl around and you would see, images like this. He studied praxis. Actually was one of the earliest studies, people who studied praxis in his own way, recording all types of human movement. If anybody has seen one of my favorite movies of all time, Holy Motors, which is a French existentialist film from about 10 years ago, it begins with some of these actually. Anyway, so now we have this, we did all this stuff with cameras, learned all kinds of new things. But now we have computer vision. So computer vision, I will not get into the details of the mathematics of it. It is above my pay grade, so to speak, literally in a way. But we've applied this now to looking at motor imitation in autism. So we developed this brief and highly engaging video game task that I'm going to show you. Collaborated with our computer vision experts, Renee Vidal, at the time at Hopkins, now has moved on to University of Pennsylvania. And we continue collaborating with our team, shown on the right, on the left. And basically, this is just going to be a very brief video that just shows the type of things that we have them imitate. So you have this avatar that does these kind of moves. I like to sort of jokingly call them, or affectionately call them in a way, voguing moves. So that they imitate these moves for 1 minute. And then we use this approach, dynamic time warping, which is sort of an algorithm that is described here, which takes the temporal and spatial fidelity of the participant's movement in comparison to the avatar, and basically in the end then derives this computerized assessment of motor imitation CAMI score. We painstakingly human observation coded all of them as well initially, and in a study that Bahar Tungchenk was the first author on from a couple of years ago, it was December 2021. So about 2.5 years ago, showed first of all very strong correlation between the human observation coding and the CAMI scores. Don't ask us why don't ask me why I told it we had a trial 1A, 1B, and 2. They basically were 3 distinct trials. We just had particular reasons initially for labeling that, but basically we showed very robust correlation between the three and between the two, between human observation coding and the CAMI derived scores. And here's what's even better is that this was particularly true for trial 2, but it was true across all the trials. We actually found that CAMI outdid human observation coding in classifying children with autism versus typically developing children. So using this now new lamppost, we are able to actually more reliably, and it seems with more valid precision, be able to assess human autism imitation, particularly as it applies to children with autism. So where are we going from here? Well, we're scaling up, broadening the autism population. These were school-age children with autism versus typically developing children. And we're now using simpler sequences and moving down to younger children as young as 3 years of age. We're going to see if we're successful, but we're having them sit and do just much more sort of repetitive sequences rather than sort of more dance-like movements. We want to scale this to 2D cameras. That's where Renee Vidal and the computer vision experts come in. So we're now have started recording with iPhone cameras in addition to this Kinect System 3D camera. Nevertheless, the Kinect System camera actually has a 2D camera in it as well, and we've already compared our 2D camera recordings to the 3D that's generated from the Kinect System camera, and we're seeing comparable results and have published a bit on that. And the idea is to then, doing that, be able to potentially move this to clinic and home settings for various reasons. So as mentioned, we have published on the 2D camera recordings from the Kinect System being effective at distinguishing autism in typically developing children and correlating with SRS autism severity scores in similar, with somewhat similar, maybe a little bit better with the 3D, but still fairly robust with the 2D cameras as well. And Dan published on this. Of course, these Kinect systems are sort of these big television screen monitors. They're actually not even commercially available anymore. We have to buy them off of eBay. Microsoft decided to stop making them because they weren't making money as a video gaming system. They were they were outstripped by Nintendo and everybody else. And so, but there's still plenty available and we still use them. But our idea is to really be able to use phone cameras or just computer cameras, 2D cameras to be able to do this. And we are moving towards that. We're also looking at specification. I mean, it's nice that it distinguishes autism in typically developing, but really can it distinguish from ADHD, developmental language disorder, pure intellectual disability. So we're looking at other populations, and we have a paper under review right now. I will actually say it's under review in British Journal of Psychiatry. We've been waiting several weeks, but we think for our first reviews. But we are finding that the children with ADHD, shown here in red, perform about the same as the neurotypical children. Whereas the children with autism, our comorbidity rates are 50 to 70% of ADHD and autism. And it doesn't matter whether they have comorbid ADHD or they don't. We're seeing about comparable levels of impairment. So it suggests that imitation assessed with CAMI is associated with autism, but not really with ADHD. The other thing we find is that it's associated. Interesting, we did not see so far in this cohort an association with the SRS as much, but we did see an association with the ADOS fairly robustly, but no association with the Conners scores for measuring ADHD severity. All right, so we are also then wanting to look at underlying brain features related to CAMI imitation. This is another sort of drunk under the lamppost discussion. So we have these sort of models that I've shown previously from Marco Iacoboni, but also from Werner, showing, and Werner a little more appropriately in the left hemisphere, showing connection between the IPL and premotor regions, ventral premotor and inferior frontal gyrus as being crucial to imitation, along with the self-other mapping STS. And again, this system is the sort of the praxis system with the addition of the STS for self-other mapping. So people have tried to apply this to brain imaging using fMRI. So Morella Depreto looked at this and showed reduced activation during imitation and observation of small finger movements in the scanner, because that's what you could do in an fMRI scanner. So we need a new lamppost. And fortunately, there are some things coming along. Now there's EEG, but there's challenges with EEG as well. But now we're working with our colleague, Adam Egerbrecht, who is a internationally recognized expert in development of what's called high density diffusion optical tomography. This is basically FNIRS exploded. So it's optical tomography imaging up. FNIRS is sort of what's generally been referred to as near infrared spectroscopy to look at optical tomography, to look at cortical brain activation. It has limitations. It's a mile wide and an inch deep, kind of literally. You can only look at the cerebral cortex. You can't look at deeper systems. I, for one, have been long-standingly interested in the cerebellum and its contributions to all this, and have published a bunch on that. I won't get into that today, but it is a limitation here. But at least we can have. Now, we initially, Adam and his team in WashU in St. Louis have developed this sort of system that's very comfortable, and very young children can sit in it, sort of like a hairdryer kind of thing. And you sit there and you have freedom of movement to do all sorts of things, but you have to sit in a chair in this device, under this device. Here in Great Britain, again, there is Gower Lab, who is developing this LUMO system, and we are in the process of, we're very close, in the next month or so, we believe, purchasing a range of caps for children ranging from infants to adults that are wearable, and we have assessed feasibility and comfort at some level too, and fairly comfortable, and it will allow us to assess activation in the brain during performance of this task. Adam has published on the fact that HDDOT, at least at the cortical level, provides comparable assessment to fMRI, and has published on this, including in autism. And now we're collaborating on studies. We have funding from both NIH and some foundations to pursue this. So in the last minute or so here, I'm just going to quickly talk about intervention. So we're looking at learning, and we're thinking about the fact that these children, we think children, autism is a skill deficit. It's a problem with acquiring skills that range from simple motor skills to social communicative skills. And so there are therapeutic implications for this in terms of how to improve skills, teaching skills. One is to play to the strength and say, maybe we just increase the proprioceptive feedback somehow. And we have been thinking about that, including with Hapticard, as I've shown. But it could be challenging because you have to somehow provide input to the proprioceptive system, which would almost require an exoskeleton or some very complex robotic devices. Now we're working towards that as one approach, but the other approach is to work around. To work through. So what I mean by that, let me just sort of jump to some slides here. So instead of actually sort of increasing reliance on somatosensory feedback, one other way, and I talk about some ways that could be done, by like actually moving the child's hand, which people do for teaching sign language sometimes in autism, as well as then sort of robotic approaches like the haptic gaming test that I showed you. I'm going to talk about handwriting for a second. We've looked at that. The other approach is that can we improve their ability to actually use the visual feedback? As that this is what's really going to be crucial to social learning. You want the children, adults, doesn't matter, who have these deficits. And again, you know, autism is heterogeneous. We're not seeing it in all children with autism, but we're seeing it in a majority, 50% or so plus. We want, if we can somehow improve the connectivity of that system that I've shown images of earlier, through some kind of intervention training, might we then allow them to then, in the naturalistic world, be able to better acquire skills through observing others' actions. So by increasing that frontal parietal connectivity. One possibility is external stimulation, like TMS or TDCS. We thought about that a bit. It's complicated. We delved into it a little bit and then sort of honestly backed off, in part more than anything because the children were having difficulty tolerating it. But then the other possibility is that knowing that from some of the literature that slower speed, by reducing the dynamic nature of the stimulus, by slowing the speed of stimulus, we might be able to improve visual motor integration in autism and the ability to perform these skills. Can we use slower speed and repeated practice to enhance imitation and underlying visual motor connectivity in autism? So slow the speed, have them train on that, and then gradually increase it with repeated practice to improve that ability, but also maybe also rewire the system and improve the connectivity within the system, which is something we hope to examine with HDDOT. So we've done a little bit of piloting with this, where we sort of slow the speed down to 60% speed, as shown here, and we see basically everybody improves. So the typically developing children shown here in red, and we have their CAMI score on the y-axis. They improve, going from 100% speed to 60% speed. But so do the children with autism, and the children with autism seem to then improve to sort of a level that is comparable to the sort of the baseline of the typically developing children. So we think that this might offer some promise for this. So I hope I've sort of walked you through sort of what we're doing of leveraging motor system observation to look at behavior, brain, and then try to move to intervention, which we're just starting to do now. I'd like to once again acknowledge all the contributors and support for this work, and leave you with this picture of me and my corgi. My corgi, who I will say is, I mean, corgis are brilliant, but she demonstrates this as much as any human. She is brilliant at catching balls. I mean, I could throw a speeded ball to her and she could catch it in her mouth, bounce balls to her. She catches it all the time. And she is quite the social being as well. I mean, I watch her joint attention. I watch her eyes like move back and forth. So I think this is trans species as well. But anyway, thank you for your attention. Sorry to go a minute or two over. I'm happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Stuart. That was a fantastic talk, and from a selfish point of view, I'm very happy you went over because I got more content. Otherwise, we wouldn't have got in. But it was a beautifully pitched and walked through an incredibly huge amount, a massive amount of work that you've been at the centre of, and it's fascinating. We've got to, if people need to go for clinics and other things, please head off, and those online will as well. But please do put questions in the chat. There's a few there already you might come back to, and obviously in the room as well. But just to pick up on one thing about I presume most of the studies that you've shown are in children. There are a few you flagged up as in adults, but I was just thinking sort of longitudinally with these skill developments, how much is there a sort of hard, is it just delayed, or how much is there a sort of ceiling to motor development? And I was of particular interest to a game we'll have to tell you about if you don't know much about it, but cricket, which is obviously our baseball equivalent, the better version of baseball. Because I think whether it comes to that sport or other sports, there are certain repetitive motor behaviours, and I think there's something about that might potentially not, it might not be as difficult to achieve that high-level sporting skill potentially with a sort of autistic phenotype, and whether there's any sports, whether it's very difficult to get to that, not just sort of like the sort of normal range, but into the sort of exceptional range of sports or sporting performance, what's known about that, and linked to that when it comes to mimicry. You're doing motor mimicry, but do you ever do something that's got a bit more, like voice mimicry, and whether again things like the extreme form of that, voice artists and actors, and whether again that's a sort of with an autistic phenotype that it's sort of you can't ever with these workarounds or work throughs or whatever, but just lots of there to unpick about sports and performance.
All excellent questions, and some questions that I've gotten before. So first of all, I'll take the last one first. Yeah. So I have been thinking about it for 10 years and haven't done it, but I think that this over-reliance on proprioceptive feedback and tendency to discount dynamic visual feedback may also play out with dynamic auditory feedback. And frankly, all auditory feedback is dynamic in the sense that that we don't have, I could close my eyes right now and pretty much picture this room. I can hold it in my working memory. Auditory is much more challenging that way. And is it possible that some of the language aspects, for instance, are related to a tendency to have difficulty with linking auditory feedback to movement, which is important for speech as much as anything else that we do, obviously being the movement of everything and that is involved in speech. And then reading, because reading is, as Martha, my mentor, said, Martha Denkla, it's barking at speech, but barking at print. You just suppress the barking, once you learn to read fluently. Yes, I think that very well may be, and that is worth examining. How we examine the reliance, what I've struggled with is how do I examine the reliance on auditory versus proprioceptive feedback for that, and that's what I've sort of struggled to come up with the task for. So I think that that's something that I've long-standing had interest in it, and I think that it's a very valid question. Many numbers of people have asked me about it over the years. As for sports, well, I don't know what to say what the studies show. I can tell you that the studies using motor batteries show high levels of motor difficulty in autism. We published a study that showed particularly the aiming and catching section of the NABC as opposed to the gaits and gait stance and the manual dexterity, were particularly what distinguished autism from ADHD in typically developing children. There was some aspect of gait and station, but more it was gait and stance, but it was particularly aiming and catching. And honestly, we broke aiming and catching down to aiming and catching separately, because aiming and catching are funny. They're like peanut butter and jelly. They're these things that go together because it's involved in a back and forth, but they're very different skills. And it's catching that really relies on the dynamic visual motor integration. And I would submit that it is a wide-ranging experience that many, not all, but many people with autism struggle with ball sports, especially with sort of fast-moving balls. That said, my wife and I battle about this. So I say, like, my wife's a big believer in anybody can learn anything, and that is because she's an incredibly skilled person and an incredibly humble person. So she's very skilled, and she believes that, like, sure, like if I could do it, other people could learn things. And I say, honey, some people just can't hit the curveball. I just say, and she thinks, no, with enough practice, you can hit the curveball. So, and I agree with her in principle. I'm not, by no means am I saying that it's like it's impossible, can't do it. But I do think that it's more of a struggle. That said, if somebody with autism is determined to be a, fantastic cricket player, I think with enough like focus and practice and maybe with some, potentially things that we learn about better ways to learn things. It's yes, I would not dismiss that at all. And there's always exceptions for the rule. The big one that gets brought up to me in terms of motor skills is instrument playing. But I think that instrument playing actually relies a lot on, if you do it at your best if you're not looking at the visual feedback. You're not relying on the visual feedback. There are obviously, and another question I get asked all about all the time is congenital blindness. I won't go down that road right now, but we can talk about that a bit. But we know that there are many, many brilliant congenitally blind piano players or early onset blind piano players, and we can name famous ones. I'll name Art Tatum for those who are want to go way back, but in jazz history, but obviously Stevie Wonder and Ray Charles and all kinds of people. So I do think that there, and if you're playing like obviously violin or something like that, you really you can't really look. And so I think that there is maybe something about learning those kind of particular motor skills where you're better off relying on proprioceptive feedback and dismissing the visual feedback where there might be actually some advantage. Okay, so I hope that answers your question.
That's fascinating. I could listen to all that. One quick to hold you up on your analogy of peanut butter and jelly. That's in England, that's the wrong message. We all think that's the worst possible combination of things.
Cream and jelly.
That's the peanut butter and jelly. Was it that you said?
I know, but should I say cream and jelly?
Probably strawberry jam and cream with a
strawberry
jam and cream. Equivalent. Yes, perfect match of something.
But that are clearly distinctly different.
Yeah, but it's funny, Frankie, but studies at high level, has anybody screened for ASD traits in exceptional physical athletes? If you said to me, has that ever been done?
Not that I know of. I will tell you colloquially, there is a diagnosis. There is a neurodevelopmental diagnosis that's associated with they have seem to show a better predilection for being good at sports, and it makes a lot of sense. And that is Tourette's syndrome.
Yeah.
Now, as Tourette's syndrome is something I've published on and studied and been fascinated over the years as well. And I can get into long discussions about Tourette's syndrome, but it is in a way a short circuit between sensory and motor that results in this tic. We don't quite understand the mechanism, nor the genetics, nor much, despite the sort of very more homogeneous nature of it. But yes, there are quite a number of stories of people with tics who are quite good at sports. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And they also have OCD, and I'm very fascinated. Longstanding Mary Robertson, who's actually from England, I believe, as well, has talked about the parallel of tics and that the tic is like the premonitory sensory urge is like the obsession, and the tic is like the compulsion that relieves that. And yes, and you could argue that maybe these people, their obsessive compulsive nature drives them, but I do think that there really is something about their physiology that contributes to a potential to acquire skills more readily.
Yeah.
Autism, I think it's the opposite. I think that there is not a lot of great example of it. There's great examples of people with autism doing great things, of course, but sports is, and particularly fast moving ball sports are not often one of them.
Amazing, thank you. So I know it's a really busy questions for the audience. Anybody here? If there aren't any, just one. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Really fascinating talk. I just wanted to ask about imagine we had kind of computer vision technology, so we could kind of record something on a smartphone and kind of create a diagnosis. How do you think that would kind of affect the wider society? I don't know if that's a kind of theoretical question. It seems like quite a thing you could imagine.
Well, this is let's say, first of all, I said above my pay grade. So Renee Vidal at Hopkins, the only way they keep these people at academic institutions anymore is that they are 50%, and that's the max they can do. They are 50% working for, he's working for Amazon, Google, et cetera. That is the way it happens, at least in the States, is that these people, it's the only way they can keep them in academic institutions at this point. And it's the, right. So it's the broad spectrum, no pun intended, question about AI and machine learning generally as we sort of rocket into our Kurzweilian existence. You know, these things could be used to answer questions and help guide, you know, therapies, and that could be really useful. And honestly, Renee, certainly by no means, the amount of money he gets from grants and or for his personal salary that is devoted to like autism is minuscule, but yes, he puts a good amount of effort and is willing to meet with us because he is one of those people who remains in academia in part because he is motivated to try to apply these technologies to do good things. Agreed though, absolutely. Like we have to be careful, and it's another drunk under the lamppost kind of thing. Like, right, we apply this technology and suddenly we have to remain humble. We think we can sort of suddenly automatically do things and trust that output when maybe we really, you know, we really can't necessarily entirely. And there's no doubt that these kind of things can be applied in more suspect, let's call it, ways. So agreed. Now I'm not in charge of the applications of computer vision technology in the world, so I can only say that I would like to at least try to apply it to things that I think are more beneficial.
Great. We've got time for one more question, if that's all right. There's Hamilton Morins online. I don't know I think he might have gone, but he's someone in our research group, and I think he's particularly interested. I'll read out his question. Unless you are there, Hamilton, I can't see you.
I can read it.
Yeah. So,
I'm curious to hear whether you believe VR-based visual motor tests are helpful in this area. Whilst the motion tracking would be more limited than camera-based approaches, it would potentially allow for alteration of somatosensory feedback and perception of agency over body movements, which may be interesting. I've thought about using VR. This is a great question, and I've thought about it, and I haven't gone down that road in part because there've been a few reasons. One is whether children with autism tolerate it. We've had some issues with just not only the comfort of the devices, but also the sort of alteration of sensorium sometimes affects. And then I don't know, it's sort of part of the drunk on the lamppost and the other joking metaphor that I say that the great philosopher, obviously in quotes, Donald Rumsfeld said that there are, you know, known knowns, unknown knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And I don't know how that's necessarily impacting that versus naturalistic environment. I do think it has potential. I've thought a little bit about it. I haven't thought enough about it. I don't know how it would necessarily, off the top of my head, be used to necessarily alter proprioceptive feedback. Visual, I understand, because obviously it's your reality is suddenly all visual. So I think it has potential, but I've thought a little bit about it, but not deeply enough about it to think about experimental designs where it may be useful to address some of these questions.
Fantastic. Well, we've gone way beyond, and it's a sort of obviously my fault, but I'm enjoying what you've been saying and how to pick your brain and this opportunity. So thank you again, Stuart, for a brilliant talk and for coming down to see us. Thank you again.
Appreciate it. Thank you.